Okay.
That works.
Okay. All right. I'm going to open up. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum, Facebook friends and family. Thank you for joining me again for another book club discussion. But before we get into the conversation slash discussion, I want to just do some real quick housekeeping things real quick. So even though I see your questions and comments, we will not entertain those questions and comments until the end of the conversation. Okay, so but you can still post them, and I will look at them probably 10 to 15 minutes before we end. Okay, so my name is Salahuddin A. Muhammad. I'm a chaplain, I'm an imam, I'm an author, and I'm also a student of the late Imam Warfdeen Muhammad. And I'm also the founder of America's Imams Book Club. The purpose of this book club is to feature Muslim American authors who have written books that address the needs of Muslims in this society that we live in. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce a friend, my brother in Islam, and our guest author for this evening book discussion. And his name is Dr. Muhammad Fraser Rahim. Dr. Muhammad Fraser Rahim is executive director of North America Quillam International. He is an expert on violent extremism issues and a scholar on Africa. Prior to his current role, he served as a senior program officer at the U.S. Institution of Peace, where he led the Horn of Africa program and served as an expert on violent extremism issues globally. Dr. Fraser Rahim's areas of specialties are transnational terrorist movements, Islamic intellectual history, Muslim communities in the West, and Africa affairs. In addition, Dr. Fraser Rahim worked for more than a decade for the Department of Homeland Security. He was the director of national intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center. There, he provided strategic advice and executive branch analyst support on violent extremist issues to the White House and the National Security Council, where he was the author or co-author of presidential daily briefings and strategic assessment on extremist ideology. Dr. Fraser has conducted research in more than 40 countries on the African continent and has worked and studied throughout the Middle East. He completed advanced level Arabic language um, certificates and various higher education institutions in the U.S., West Africa, and the Middle East, and he earned his PhD, alhamdulillah, in 2017 from Howard University in African Studies with a focus on Islamic thought and on violent extremist issues. Dr. Fraser Rahim provided one of the first doctoral dissertations on the intellectual thought of African American Muslims and its nexus to the broader Islamic world using original primary sources in both Arabic and English, and focused on the American Muslim thinker W.D. Muhammad. Title: The Making of American Islam and the Emergence of the Western Islamic Intellectual Thought to Counter Violent Extremism, a case study of American Muslim revivalists, Imam Warfdi Muhammad. Lastly, he's the author of the newly published book, America's Other Muslims, Imam W.D. Muhammad, Islamic Reform and the Making of American Islam. So I want to say, alhamdulillah, it's a pleasure to have you on. And just want to go ahead and get into it. So the title of the book is America's Other Muslims, Imam W.D. Muhammad, Islamic Reform and the Making of an American Islam. So the title, America, Other Muslim. Now we know that as African Americans or as Black Muslims, we have always been seen as a face of Islam. Mm-hmm. So why the title, America's Other Muslims? Why that title?
Great. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It is an honor and pleasure to be here with you, Brother Imam, and certainly your work and contributions speaks for itself in your wonderful book, America's Imam. So I wanted to start off with that and do the appropriate acknowledgement for as well. Because and this is the cover of it right here. The play on America's Other Muslims is really the providing a commentary to say that when we think about normative Islam in the 20th century, when we talk about Islam, perhaps in the 19th century in the United States, it is one based off of the legacy of the enslaved African experience and the various Islamic hybrid movements that have journeyed into what we know the modern day American Muslim community. And so historically for individuals' memory, collective memory, what it means to be Muslim in America, it is based off of those identities, those ethnicities that come from historically from West Africa, and then a new people that developed in new ways of what we see Islam on its own terms in America. And so America's Other Muslims is actually a bit of a play on words to say, hey, the foundational indigenous Muslim community that helped establish what we know modern day American institutions has in many ways been erased. It has been a slow erasure, whether it has been forced or whether it has been for various reasons. But when we think about the current Muslim community, it is oftentimes the tropes are Islam equals fundamentalism, Islam equals immigrant, Islam equals foreign. And that is such a contrast to what we know Islam from being in the 19th and the 20th century. So what I wanted to do is to perhaps give a catchy title, but to also bring the reader. The late Dr. Suleiman Yang, who was my teacher at Howard, used to always say, you have a contractual relationship with the reader with a title. And he says, what you have is that you get them to you show them or you introduce them to a new concept, or perhaps an old one, and then from there you can explain your thesis and your argumentation. So really, that's what it came from, to this community, to help give rise to the modern day American institutions of Isna Care, Zaytuna College, all these different sort of modern day MSAs. Really owe their credit to this early Muslim community. So in many ways, the legacy of what we know enslaved African Muslims, the legacy of the late Imam Warfi Muhammad, the legacy of the Dar movement, the legacy of the Moorish Science Depot, the legacy of these various individuals and personalities and organizations that helped build this, in fact, and now becomes the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's kind of like we have to reintroduce ourselves, kind of, sort of. And so your book and my book, inshallah, has reintroduced Imam Muhammad, but also the African American Muslim and our contribution to the American society and also the world as a whole. One of the things that I got from the book, or I would say the intent, or one of the intents behind the book, was that you wanted to connect African Islam to African American Islam that was broken up or that was wedged by chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is one of the ways or one of the catalysts that you use in the book to bridge the gap between African Islam and African American Islam?
Thank you. So really good points. I point to, several people have been using this as book club, even at the $90 academic price. So my apologies. And I've tried to help out people along the way. But, but anyway, for those who did buy photocopies, et cetera, in your library, you can figure some creative ways to do that. But on page 25, I think it's a really nice, I laid out what I would call the West African Islamic curriculum. And in this, the Qawaid al-Salah, the Muqtasar al-Akhdari, the Al-Ashmawiyya, the Nazmu Muqaddimah Ibn Rushd, the Al-Risala, Al-Murshid Al-Ma'in, Misbah Al-Sadiq. These are classical Islamic texts. And I normally I don't always spend extra time on it, but I wanted to frame those and say them for a specific reason. If you are anywhere throughout the Islamic world, you are used to certain ways of memorization. If you study in the Arabic world and Islamic world in West Africa, you might have learned of the rhythmic memorization of Arabic grammar. You might be familiar with the Ajramiyya. This is a well-known approach toward Arabic memorization. For the community of Imam Warfi Muhammad, they too themselves had individuals who helped them understand Arabic language. They helped them understand Quranic Arabic language. Individuals like the late Imam Qasim Ahmed, Imam Yahya Abdullah, our brothers and sisters who are down in Houston, Texas, are well known of creating a practical Arabic booklet for, in this case, African Americans, recognizing learning styles, recognizing pedagogy, recognizing practical Arabic booklet. Because in the Islamic world, those books that I just referenced have been used as a blueprint for hundreds of years for individuals to pass down knowledge. So I remember studying in West Africa, coming from this community of the late Imam Muhammad, studying in West Africa. And some of my teachers at the time would say, hey, are you familiar with that Risala? Are you familiar with the works of Imam al-Akhdari? Are you familiar with etc.? All these. And I think for many individuals in the broader Islamic world, these books are they're used to them. It's like us reading A Raisin in the Sun. It's like you reading To Kill a Mockingbird in a secular context. And so I bring this up because what's happened is, historically speaking, individuals in those key personalities, particularly West African Muslims who came to America, like Omar ibn Said, like Yara Mahmoud, like Salih Balali, who we know wrote down from memory part of the work of the work of the Risala, right? So there's this memory, there's this knowledge of cultivation back in home country. In the case of Omar ibn Said, studying for 25 years with his brother, who taught him Islamic knowledge, taught him Islamic science. So can you imagine this wealthy tradition leaving the Arabian Peninsula, Islam spreading, coming down and spreading into post 7th century onward, coming into West Africa, from North Africa into West Africa, and this slow, what we call acculturation, this slow assimilation, but also slow Islamization, if you will. Not Arabization, but Islamization on its own terms in the West African context, still respecting the time-honored tradition. You move this forward, and then you have these West African Muslims, men primarily, and I think that we're going to probably find some women soon. I'll leave it there on that. There might be some things developing. And what I would say to you is that these individuals brought with that knowledge. And then essentially, as the late Dr. Suleiman Yang has said, as Samir Rashid, very well-known scholars who've written on the African Muslim experience, Gane Cambrias, I'm saying his name wrong, who's written extensively on Islam in the United States. There was essentially a cutoff between African Islam, Arab Islam, if you will, that knowledge of continuity coming from centuries of Islam from what we know, the East, and then what we know, African American Islam. When that was severed, that link, including those texts, that knowledge base, was not able to have a continuity that one would be able to trace and continue on from generations to generation. And so what I argue is that for many African American communities, including early Muslim communities, Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, the precursor organization, even the Dar movement and these Sunni Islamic movements, it was this desire to pull where they can from the broader Islamic world and slowly develop and establish some foundational roots of what it means to be Muslim in America. And so this is why when you have individuals who are curious to say, well, the practices of Muslims in America, African American Muslims, are different. There's some of it is what I'm used to, but they do things slightly different. And so when individuals in the community, Imam Muhammad might have mastered a certain level of technical Islamic science and knowledge, in the Islamic world, they would say, hey, you're given an ijazah. You're given a license in this particular science, and you have a mastery on this. In the community itself, this was probably loosely organized and not clearly defined, but individuals in their own way, on their own more community structures, receive similar ijazas, but without the labeling that individuals are used to back in the Islamic world. I hope that makes sense, because I think this is an important element in a transition of helping people understand the Islam of Africa and the Islam connecting to the centers of Islamic intellectual learning. And then when we see modern day African American Muslim community, and what I would argue to say, and the book doesn't totally unpack this, but I think it's important, is that regardless of your ideological persuasion as being African American Muslims, including African American Salafi communities, including African American Sufi communities, including African American Sunni and Shia, and non-denominational, if you will, there is this desire to find and to connect themselves back to that chain. But in many respects, that chain has been cut off. So how do you recreate that? And then also, how does it look like in the West, in light of so many different factors that become labeled as political Islam or apolitical Islam, or you connecting yourself back to your old country, etc.
Yeah. Well, so like I told you, I said in your book, each chapter could be a book.
Absolutely.
Because you could just expand and expand and expand on so much stuff. But to tie into what we just talked about, can you also talk about, because you talk about in your book how Islam spread through West Africa, and what are some of the lessons that we can learn from how the West Africans embraced Islam? Because in your book you talk about how For example, you say that they replaced their African mystical practices of superstition with Quranic verses. And so when we look at Islam and how Islam spread during the time of the Prophet, that it didn't come and destroy customs and culture. It just came to kind of, I would say, cultivate it more and then take out the bad of it. But it didn't come to wipe it out.
Yeah.
So in your book, you talk about how Islam spread through West Africa and how the West Africans embraced it. And I think there's some lessons in it that we can learn.
Well, you know, as a historian, I always like to give footnotes. I mean, I think three well-known public scholars have written extensively on West Africa. Usman Khan, if you're not familiar with, based out of Harvard, has done extensive body of work on Timbuktu as a place of Islamic intellectual learning. Zachary Wright, with a Z, has done a phenomenal body of work on looking at the Tijaniya, this West African Sufi movement community, the role of Ibrahim Niasse, the role of Dar al-Faida, this community of just influential transnational networks, and lastly, the work of Rudolf Ware, who certainly you're probably familiar with in terms of his work on West African Islam, its body of knowledge, and it spread both spiritually, religiously, and also through education and literacy. So I always like pointing that just for footnotes purposes for people. In addition, yes, Islam, it's fascinating because Islam, we know historically speaking, Islam spreading into Java, Islam spreading in South Asia, going into Indonesia and Malaysia, through business and trade, through spices, going into Tanzania. If you go down to Swahili Coast, you see this trading as a means of exchange, right? Of ideas, of exchange of merchandise, of commercial exchange, of business. But also, we know historically the role of religious thinkers, spiritual thinkers also have been an influential role of spreading faith. And so, it's important to recognize that you have both religion and you also have business that become a very integral role of propagation of religion, in this case, newfound faith Islam, coming into West Africa, merged with those African traditional systems. I think we have to really rethink how we talk about. I don't use the term native religion. I don't use the term pagan, because I think it's important to understand the context when we talk about African traditional religion, meaning they have a way of systems of knowledge of being prior to the advent of dominant Islam, Christianity, Judaism coming into. And you can use that all throughout the world. And the reason why I say that is you look at the Dogon. They have a complex system of knowledge, of cosmology, and how they see. So we have to, and I use this about to segue into the African American experience, is that I think African Muslims throughout the Sahel, throughout West Africa, throughout the Mano River region countries, meaning Sierra Leone and Gambia, Liberia, had a framing of how they existed and practices as Islam is slowly coming into. This isn't coming in overnight. The same way that Islam came into the United States. We look at the enslaved African period with these individuals, two personalities. We have the Ahmadiyya movement that certainly had influences, and we see it. We see the roles of Black nationalism. And then you see an amalgamation through these various movements. On top of what I call orthodox movements or orthodox individuals who bring what they consider the pure religious values that are a bit more conservative. So can you imagine having these various spiritual thinkers and these business leaders coming, converging, and then you have these traditional value systems? How do they negotiate? Do they separate? Do they converge? Do they oppose? Do they converge? Do they diverge? And I think in many respects, they do all of the above. Those three individuals I just highlight, they're additional individuals just to point to, and there's about 5-10 more to provide. But what I think they offer is also a blueprint for us to consider how we look in the Americas, and particularly in America, because those replacement of those amulets and putting, instead of maybe putting a traditional practice, custom, might be an animal or a bird feather, or it might be something to connect them with their ancestor, right? In these African traditional ways of being, and as is broadly ontology and understanding who they are, but also how were they able to negotiate within Islam? So then the replacement of those traditional values, and then maybe putting a Quranic verse that becomes part of the. But I can tell you also, you have both Islam as practice, or Islam as theory, Islam as idea in books, and then you also have lived Islam. And lived Islam has individuals who are negotiating between those spaces, who might still consult the medicine man, or which oftentimes, I'm not comfortable with the language, but I'll put it out there for our listeners, the witch doctor, or consulting the individual who can connect to the occult. Now, does that make them less than a Muslim? These are questions that have come out, right? And there's an interesting debate or conversation happening right now in Nigeria. Individual who is a nasheed artist. He sings praise songs of the Prophet. But the blasphemy laws that are happening right now in Nigeria, this particular case, you can look it up. The individuals have said that he has elevated his spiritual teacher above the Prophet Muhammad, right? And so the question is, right, is he doing that? Is he not? Is he just saying how much he loved and revered his teacher, and he's still honoring the Prophet Muhammad or not? And I just bring these examples because this is what happens in public space, right? And then who occupies these spaces? And so I think these are beautiful examples for us to understand that you have Islam coming into these communities. You have a normative Islam, a pure Islam that's able to negotiate and adapt and respect their cultural traditions and Islam. And then you also have, with the advent of a broader Muslim awakeness slowly moving into the 14th century onward, you have the jihad movements that come, and then you have individuals who say, we're bringing in a true Islam, and then oftentimes that is carried out through conquest, through missionary activities, through war. And the late Sheikh Uthman Danfodio, certainly we know his jihad movements that are well known throughout the West African society, and throughout modern day Nigeria, Cameroon, etc. So I think to summarize, because I'm being a bit long-winded, is that I think that this is a really interesting gem, because to consider for African American communities to take a step back, to think about how Islam has come into the United States and how that negotiation has taken place, and how various groups and communities and personalities have highlighted and said they are representative of true Islam, and how communities have wrestled with how do you negotiate being in a new space and the tradition or their value systems prior. And so in the community of Imam Muhammad, and particularly this book, the late Imam Wafdi Muhammad was someone who built off of the tradition of his father's teachings, polished things, refined them, and then offered in his particular methodology a way to be both American and Muslim, and offered various blueprints and strategies for that. And I think in the same way that he did that, it builds off of a rich legacy and tradition in West Africa, in the Arab world, in Asia, as Islam has spread all over. And I think that as historians, as students of history, we have to look at them in those contexts rather than quick from the hip reaction to how to respond and just blanket say, well, this is Islamic, this is un-Islamic. And I think in many times there are many gray zone areas if we're looking at both from a theological, religious perspective, and then also as we look at a lived religious experience, which might not always be the same from the theory, the book concept of what religion is, and then how people apply them as well.
Yeah. I agree with you 100%. And I think, like I said earlier, Islam comes to help cultivate culture. It doesn't come to destroy it. And I think one of the things about the community of Imam Muhammad is that we were able to not take on someone else's cultural Islam.
Yeah.
We were able to hold on to whatever cultural Islam that we had kind of formed in America.
Exactly.
So just to try to shift gears a little bit. So in the book, you talk about the concept of mujaddid, and that's like one of the hot topics. That's a hot topic to talk about. Mujaddid, and so we know the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that every century there will come a mujaddid. So when we look at this century that we're living in now, and we look at all the different leaders or the figures that are out there now, and personally for me, when I research all the different leaders out there in this century, Imam Muhammad's name always comes to my mind. And so in your book, you also talk about Imam Muhammad being a revivalist / renewer of Islam. But you also go back and you show examples of mujahideen that were from West Africa too. And so it's kind of like you made like a linkage between them. And so can you talk about that a little bit too?
Yeah. So I heard someone one time said Imam Mufti Muhammad was not what we would consider a classical mujtahid imam, right? And again, I think these terminologies oftentimes are missed because in the community of Imam Muhammad, in the community of African American, sometimes I always like establishing, anytime I do something, key terms and references. Because if you don't establish key terms and references, we might be speaking from different sheets of music, and we might be talking about different things, or we might be talking about the same things, just using different concepts. And so when individuals I've heard say he's not a mujtahidi man, he's not trained in what we know the rigors of the Arabs are very much into the silsila, right? The chains of generation and chain, lineage. And I think many communities are looking, well, I studied under this sheikh, and after I studied under this sheikh, he passed this book to me, and from there and there and there, all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, or from a very pious person. You are very familiar with this, and for the sake of time, I won't get into specific regions of the world, but this is well known and documented. So for those who are listening, they'll be familiar with this. And so what Imam Muhammad was, I think, negotiating through this space is this role of being both a person who engages in the broader aspects of the inner struggle, from jahada, right, to struggle, to resist, to find ways of earnestly giving all your energy to understand a matter, to becoming and engaging in ijtihad, independent analytical thinking, and struggle in thinking, and then also being a person who is also what I would characterize a mujtahidi man, right? This is not language that is used internally in the community, but I'm saying this to merge and build between both a classical tradition, a traditional Islam that people are very familiar with, and then also those who have engaged with the community of Imam Muhammad who aren't familiar with the language and that discourse internally. But what he provided in being a mujtahidi man was someone who was struggled, who was challenging earnestly in all his might, based off of a Quranic Arabic lens, and then also filtered through the experience of the life example of Muhammad the Prophet, and finally, and most importantly, through the lens of being in the circumstance of living in the West, and particularly as an African American. Those filters also are just as important as we look at the various imams from Sahadawi, from Ibn Hazm, to Al-Ghazali, to Al-Shatibi, to Abdul Qadir Jilani, to the various Islamic thinkers who have come before. Whether you agree with Mutazilite thinking on Islam, if you agree or not with interpretations of Shia discourse and their various imams, the big debate is on do you celebrate or do you not celebrate Eid al-Gadr, the Shia essentially Eid, and there's a whole debate, right, post Eid al-Adha, right? And so what I would say to you is that what Imam Muhammad was offering was something absolutely part of the rich tradition of all revivalists, renewers, and thinkers. The same way that someone is familiar with the Ihya Ulum-ad-Din of Imam Ghazali and his desire to revive Islamic sciences in the time-space context of his life in both a Arab and Islamic world, is the same way that Imam Muhammad was on his own terms engaging in reviving Islamic sciences in a broader Arab Islamic world and bring a fresh interpretation through his lens and experience. And I think that's important to highlight, because these various revivalists that have come as a result of being in their context. And so what I argue is that Imam Muhammad brought about, and I argue and I highlight and I call him the 21st century intellectual. I even call him a patron saint. I know for some Muslims, like, what do you mean by sainthood? If you go look at the definition of sainthood, it's not a very mystical, outer worldly idea that many people might have. Sainthood also means someone who lived a life of perfection, a life of just a virtuous life, who lived a life of earnestly struggling and trying to provide needs for the poor. Someone who provided assistance for those who did not have clear perspective or who might have had elementary interpretation of religion, and who helped mature them in their understanding. Building off of the Catholic tradition, right? So I did that purposefully to say, yes, his sainthood, in this play on terms, was someone who brought a fresh, original interpretation and added toward the discourse of being both American and Muslim. At the times when co-religion is coming from the broader Arab Islamic world, we're very hesitant to talk about patriotism. We're very hesitant to talk about interfaith dialogue. Who are very hesitant to talk about having a fresh read on the Quran itself from their time-space circumstances. So for me, that is revivalism. That is renewal. That is a renaissance. Pick your term. Ihya, Islah, these terms, whatever, Tajdeed, this, you can pick the term. He simplified it and made it available for the common man and said, I'm just bringing you a language. So his careful use of both Western, Eastern, Quranic, most importantly, framing and references were part of what his decision of propagation of Islam, both for an American and a broader Muslim world audience. And so that's how I would frame it. I mean, Imam Muhammad brought with him what no one else could do, that not perhaps even his father was able to do, that he was able to connect to a broader Muslim narrative, but do it on his own terms and using the Quranic references and saying, when people ask him, what gives you the religious authority to come up with what you're doing? Where is your silsila? Where is your teacher? Who is your teacher? And his response in English, simple, clear terms: the one who created me shall guide me. And for that itself is perhaps enough said to not even go any further. A person who directly engages with God himself as his teacher, as his guide, as his narrator in life. And I think that is an important contribution for the broader Muslim world. What I would say, and lastly on this point, is that for African American Muslims, the mastery of the classical Islamic tradition is the same way that one should do when you're also learning secular sciences. You study, you learn, you pay attention. But to me, what is also even more profound for our young people who are coming behind it, you can memorize. This is something that has been done for centuries. You can also memorize these various works and books, but how will it apply to your time-space reality if you're not able to connect it? It has to be applied to your context. And so the only reason why we keep alive the great imams that are before us, Imam Abu Raza, I'm a reader across the Islamic tradition. Islamic civilization has a breadth of knowledge, but sometimes I extract them, but I also try to apply with the reality of what they are. And so those imams that have come they came for their particular time. Those women who brought knowledge came for their particular time. And I think in the context of American other Muslims, they have to be comfortable. And I say they, removing myself for a moment in a level of objectivity, they have to be courageous and be comfortable to have mastery of those sciences, clear mastery of those traditions, but be comfortable to equally be saying that they are also American, because this is the time reality that Allah gave them to live in. And how do you balance the two?
And that's key. That's key that Imam Muhammad said, "Alladhi khalaqani fahuwa yahdi." He said, "The one who created me should guide me." And so, him being in the context of America, meaning this is a new situation. This is a new, I would say, civilization. Not like over in Saudi Arabia, not like over in Pakistan. Dealing with a people who had a certain type of plight. So there was no way for him to get an understanding of how to deal with the African American or the black Muslims plight. Because if he would have took the understanding from Saudi Arabia, it would have been like putting a square peg in a round hole. It wouldn't have worked. So he had to be guided by God in order to deal with the situation and circumstance. So alhamdulillah. When I read that part, I was like, that was right on point. Right on point. So next, we know that one of the things that Imam Muhammad tried to do was to give his community, or the African American Muslim community, a identity. And nowadays, this is one of the main buzzes that are out there. What should we call ourselves? Should we call ourselves African American Muslim? Should we call ourselves Black Muslim? What is our identity? And so Imam Muhammad, at the beginning of our community, or the nascent of our community, he gave us the title Bilal. And so in your book, you talk about that. So what do you think that title did for us? And do you think that title is relevant for now?
Well, this is if you have to look at the broader context of the community itself, as an African American, stripped of your identity, stripped of your knowledge of who you are, cut off, separated from a wealth of traditions. We just use the Islamic example. How about our brothers cut off from those traditional African ways of being? And so when individuals were awakening to Islam and these movements developed, right, into the 1900s onward, there was an awakening, even going to the Nation of Islam, and prior to that, the UNIA, influence of Marcus Garvey, and various key personalities that brought a sense of consciousness and awakeness for Black people. What this also brought about, particularly for African Americans, is this desire to connect themselves to their legacy, and particularly under the leadership of Imam Muhammad, slowly introducing both Black and Muslim key personalities. Now, we know there's a number of books that are now written out, and we know many Sahabas of the Prophet who were of African origin, not just Bilal, right? So it's always important, because sometimes people say, well, this overemphasis of Bilal. Well, Bilal was important. Certainly, we know whether you see it as authentic or not. The spirit of the hadith, the spirit of the narration, is that the Prophet Muhammad said he heard Bilal's footsteps ahead of him in paradise. Right? To me, whether it is authentic or not, it is part of at least a story, right? Because you get into hadith specialists who debate whether these things are authentic or not. But if they've made it into the broader Islamic ethos, right, our narrative and our history, our memory, then that at least says that there's this consciousness by early Muslims that there must be some reference to blackness or communities who were decided to make Islam as their way of life. And so connecting with Bilal, whether he's buried in Syria, based on where he is, but we know he's certainly buried in the Middle East, but of African origin, likely from, we know, modern day Ethiopia or somewhere in the Horn of Africa. And the decision to connect and use terms like Bilal was this ability to connect both their African and African American, or what would become African American lineage. Now, why is that important? Because every community wants to be able to connect and see themselves in scripture and who they are and that meaning and that purpose. Now, we know in the current debate right now is, the question of, is God, is Jesus, right? Is he black? Is he brown? Is he Middle Eastern? Well, elements of what Imam Muhammad was encouraging, including movements like creating racial images of divine and pushing back on that, was this push away from what historically was Black Christianity more at large, and also Black Christians who pushed this idea of Jesus being either white or Jesus being black, and stripping that racial image and saying that God, creator, the divine, the omnipotent other, is neither black nor white. He is in a realm beyond himself, beyond imaginable, with human descriptions. But also, the Bilal narrative was saying, hey, you can be both American, you can be both Muslim and black, and that you have a role to play in this. And so for a community of African Americans, it was critical to bring about a consciousness. And then you see, elements of slowly moving away from just this identification, mentioning Bilal, and embracing a more broader universalism, embracing the African American rich heritage, but also using new terminologies, including in the 80s and particularly the 90s, where the late Imam Muhammad used and shifted language of saying, our origins start in Africa. We are also a new people, and we are new Africans, a new identity in new America, and we must recognize and honor our rich tradition, but we also must find a way to express it through our journey, not a pretty journey, but a journey into this new world, and find that balance. And so you can see that evolution through various campaigns, both public campaigns, through efforts by the community themselves to get them on board as a whole in that spirit. And I think that last thing I'll say to you is that you can see the shift of moving away from just Bilalian to a consciousness of an Muslim African American identity. That the largest and oldest school system in the United States, private, was Claire Muhammad. That is such a evolution from Bilalian to Claire Muhammad, who occupies an honorific title, who comes from the legacy and from the Nation of Islam, but also continue that on in the best tradition of it as well.
Yes, alhamdulillah. Last question. So in your book, you talk about how Imam Muhammad's community is a model for to counter terrorism. It's a means, or it's a tool that people should look at and study on how to deal with terrorism. And so Imam Muhammad, he always told us that we were kuntum khayru ummatan, that we were the best community. And he always talked about that. But he didn't just talk it, but he also created an environment to protect us from outside influences so that we could eventually see that we were the best community, meaning that brought out for all of the people, or out for everyone. So in your book, you talk about how you use examples of how our community could be a case study for other nations who deal with um, extremism. So can you talk about that too a little
Yeah,
bit?
I think the blueprint for this community, even of the late Imam Muhammad, they have gone through the hard work of chattel slavery, the difficulties, the torture, the
Hmm.
brutality. They've gone through the Middle Passage, the transatlantic journey, coming to the New World, gone through Reconstruction, gone through real and not real and state-sponsored forms of, if you will, terrorism, right? The Ku Klux Klan and the derivatives. And so this community, African Americans as a whole, some who occupy the space of being African American Muslim, have gone through the challenges of what it means to be subjugated and oppressed, and have then switched in transition to say, we will get past our real grievances and we will find a member to be productive members of this society, even though the state has failed us, and also the state itself was engaging in activities historically that that did not allow them to reach their full potential, economically affected them, separated communities and families, broke down of the family, breakdown of religious institutions, etc. And so if a community themselves is able to absolutely get past those real and at times perceived grievances, then other groups who are what we see in the modern day affected by transnational terrorism, and now we have not just terrorism carried out by individuals who take the beautiful religion of Islam, but now we have white supremacists and black supremacists. So now we can find this for anyone. And what we have is a model of a community who did not resort to violence, who used their First Amendment rights to speak out and channel it through the legal process, through the legal framework of a society. That is a model that I think no other community can highlight, despite we're talking about not 100 years, but at least 400 years of institutionalized efforts across the world, and finding a productive means to still say we won't forget, but we're going to find ways in which we can be part of this society. And I think that model is important, whether you're in Denmark and Saudi Arabia, for co-religionists who are of Muslim of persuasion, to say, you know what, the African American experience has something there to listen to. How are they able to be resilient? How are they able to resort to absorb those shocks? That's what resilience is. In the case of violence, in the case of Emmett Till, how are they able to be affected like individuals like Muhammad Ali, who resisted and challenged, and then say, be known as the most important Muslim throughout this planet Earth? So I think that this is an important model for Muslims to really listen to. Whether the broader Muslim world is listening and paying attention, perhaps, perhaps not. But I think there are gems for communities, not just Muslims, who are seeking to integrate into society, regardless of religion, and finding productive ways in which they can get past those issues. And I think that's something that I think offers great gems. It's not an end all be all, but a model out of many models to approach.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. And I always, to add to what you're saying, is that when you look at our community, and if you really want to study Imam Muhammad's leadership, I always say you have to look at it prior to 9/11 and then post 9/11.
Absolutely.
To really see the effects of his leadership. Because when you look at it post 9/11, you can see all the work, all the foresight that he had prior to 9/11 helped to protect our community during the transition of 9/11. And so we had built bridges, Like you said, we got into the fabric of this country. And so that's what benefited us, getting to the fabric of this country, becoming judges, becoming politicians. This safeguarded us from any outside influences. And so saying that, I like to say thank you for coming on.
Absolutely.
And can you tell everyone where they can purchase your book at? What's the website?
You can purchase at Amazon. It's titled America's Other Muslims by Muhammad Fraser Rahim. Imam Warfdi, Muhammad, Islamic Reform and the Making of American Islam. It's also on the publisher's website, Roman and Littlefield. Working on a few other pieces of work. Inshallah, there'll be contributions toward the broader discourse of African American Muslims. And I think just continue to engage on this. But you can purchase it there. What I want to just say is thank you, our brother Imam Chaplain, for your incredible work. Reward you for all that you're doing, and I see the book. You move your head just a little bit, there you can see it. But this is the type of work that we have to put out. It's not just our words. We're saying we will go. These books will stay here that people can then say, this is memory. This is a capture of time of a community. And so for young people, I always say this, young people, because I mentor various young folks. What can you do? Write, think, learn, publish, sit, write down your stories, journal every day. I think it was it was the late, Frederick Douglass. One of our great African-American thinkers said, page a day, after 365 days, you got a full book. So just in my memory right now, one of our great minds, it'll come as soon as I leave. But you get the point that we have to document our stories. We have to, in the words of the late Imam Warfdi Muhammad, I'll leave you with this. As he was getting closer to his journey to meet his creator, he said, 4 things to live by, right? Faith in God, hard labor, high thinking, and simple living. Faith in God, hard labor, high thinking, and simple living.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So I'm going to open it up for any questions. So if you have any questions, please post it now. If you have any comments, please post it now, and we will try to address them. So someone said, how did the king of Dahomey, Dahomey justify trading with the Portuguese, which included human cargo?
So, I think the broader story, whether it's the Ghana, it's the, Songhai, various African kingdoms. I want to be a bit ecumenical in spreading the various African kingdoms. The African kings also were very much part and parcel of a broader economic trade activity of selling humans for the exchange of raw resources. And so oftentimes the bait and switch oftentimes is, you might hear from various those on the conservative side, well, Africans also sold other Africans to each other in slavery, right? And so then this rabbit hole will go in sort of to often overly generalize to say, see, Africans were involved in this and they were all selling each other. I think it's not so simple. And so to answer your question, the broader story is, yes, they played a role out of a broader role of the triangular slave trade, which was money, resources, which was driven by a broader development. We know the modern day industrial revolution, right? These raw resources coming from the continent of Africa, including African kings who were involved in those exchange, who did not have the interests of their people. So that happened. And then those resources then going into places like Sheffield, England, which helped develop large factories and processing and refinery. And then those leaving and going to what we know the New World, and going to the Caribbean where items like rum was exchanged. And then from there, human cargo stopping the Caribbean and going into what we know the United States proper. But that broader trade was driven by money and resources, including what we know the modern day economic system of capitalism in the West. So it's not so simple in that framing. But absolutely, there was a complicit engagement, a complicity by these various kings. Some who were very much involved, some who resisted. And so I would just, for the sake of time and not giving you a full history lesson on West African kingdoms and societies, that's the 30-second version of it.
Yeah. So let me see if we have any more questions, comments.
Well, one thing.
So,
no, I was going to say one thing is that this will at least be recorded, right? And
yes, it'll be recorded on my Facebook page, and I can download it.
Yeah, so it'll be recorded and saved. So I think for those in the future, you know, when you're looking for resources, this is now immortalized, and anything we can do to assist, to help in this effort, let us know. Again, encouraging people to continue to archive, document, save those gems, both for your own personal records, but also for your family and community, because they're incredible stories that can be helpful for others as well.
And to add to that, and if you need any type of, because I'm thinking about turning my book into a study guide or some type of book that I can use for a teaching guide and things like that. So, so those who would like something like that, then please let us know, because this information that we're giving, hopefully it will be a part of the archives of Imam Muhammad's language and methodology in this country. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and close this out because it's already 8:02, and I just want to tell everybody, Barakallahu Feekum. I hope Allah bless everyone, and stay safe, stay protected, because we're losing a lot of people with this COVID-19. And so, Dr. Muhammad, I'm going to give you the greetings. Assalamu alaikum. And I will talk to you soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
All righty.
All right.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.